The most dangerous mistake a person can make is believing they already know who deserves respect. The late afternoon sun hung low over Highway 41, washing the quiet gas station in warm amber light as travelers came and went without giving one another a second glance. Pickup trucks rolled past the diesel pumps. Families stretched their legs after long drives, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the convenience store every time the glass door slid open. It looked like the kind of ordinary place where nothing remarkable ever happened, and maybe that was exactly why no one noticed the woman stepping out of a dark blue SUV. She wore a simple navy jacket, comfortable jeans, and walking shoes dusted from a long day on the road. There were no flashing lights, no official convoy, no security detail surrounding her. She blended into the crowd so naturally that she could have been any American stopping to fill the tank before heading home. She smiled politely at an elderly couple struggling with the gas nozzle, offered a quiet greeting to the cashier through the window, and reached for the pump without drawing attention to herself. Across the parking lot, Officer Daniel Mercer had just finished responding to a routine traffic complaint. He prided himself on reading people quickly, trusting instincts he believed had never failed him. The moment his eyes landed on the woman, something in his expression hardened. He watched her for several silent seconds before walking across the concrete with measured confidence, one hand resting near his duty belt. Nearby conversations faded as people sensed an official interaction unfolding. "Ma'am," he called firmly, "I need to speak with you." She turned calmly, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. "Of course, officer. Is something wrong?" Mercer studied her license plate, then the SUV, then her face again. "I'm going to need identification." Without hesitation, she reached slowly toward her jacket pocket. "Certainly." Before she could finish, Mercer raised a hand. "Leave your hands where I can see them." Several customers looked up from their pumps. Someone quietly lowered a phone after pretending to check messages. The woman nodded once. "All right." There was no argument, no anger, only patience. Yet Mercer interpreted her calmness as confidence born from deception. "That vehicle belongs to the state," he said. "Care to explain that?" She answered in the same, even tone. "I can." "Save it," he interrupted. "I've heard every story." A heavy silence settled over the station. Even the humming fuel pumps seemed quieter. The woman glanced around, noticing uneasy faces watching from a distance. "Officer," she said gently, "please verify everything before making a decision you can't undo." Mercer gave a short laugh that carried farther than he intended. "That sounds exactly like something a person with something to hide would say." He instructed her to step aside while he continued questioning her, convinced he was exposing someone pretending to be important. No one watching knew the truth. They saw only a white police officer speaking with a black woman beside an unmarked government vehicle. They filled the silence with assumptions. Some whispered. Others simply watched. The woman never raised her voice. She never demanded special treatment. She simply stood with quiet dignity as the tension grew heavier by the second. Then, somewhere beyond the highway exit, faint sirens echoed across the open fields. One patrol car became two. Two became five. Within moments, an entire line of state police cruisers appeared on the horizon, their emergency lights reflecting across every windshield in the parking lot as every conversation stopped at once. Ignorance often sounds the loudest just before the truth arrives. 25 minutes earlier, before the first patrol car appeared and before curious strangers gathered around the gas pumps, Victoria Brooks had been driving alone along the quiet stretch of Highway 41, with the windows lowered just enough to let the warm spring air drift through the cabin. Cornfields rolled across the horizon in long green rows. Small churches stood beside weathered farmhouses, and American flags fluttered from front porches that had seen generations come and go. It had been a demanding week filled with legislative meetings, budget negotiations, and public appearances that stretched from sunrise until long after sunset. Yet the drive home was the one part of the day she always protected because it reminded her why she had first entered public service. Most governors traveled surrounded by security convoys, advance teams, and carefully planned schedules. Victoria respected those procedures, but every few weeks, she quietly requested permission for a simpler journey. Her security detail followed at a discreet distance instead of surrounding her, allowing her to experience the state as ordinary citizens did. She believed that leadership became disconnected the moment every inconvenience disappeared behind flashing lights and closed roads. If she wanted to understand the people she served, she needed to see the same highways, the same neighborhoods, and the same small businesses they visited every day. Earlier that afternoon, she had stopped in a small-town diner where the waitress never recognized her and recommended the homemade peach pie with genuine enthusiasm. Victoria listened to two retired veterans discussing rising grocery prices, thanked the cook before leaving, and quietly paid for the meal of a young family seated nearby, without revealing her identity. No cameras captured the gesture. No reporters wrote about it. She preferred it that way. Public service, in her mind, was measured by actions performed when nobody was watching. As she continued driving, her chief of security called to check on her location. Victoria answered with her usual calm voice and assured him that everything was on schedule. He reminded her that traveling without the full escort always made his team nervous. She smiled and promised she would stop only once for fuel before heading directly to the governor's residence. After ending the call, she reflected on the speech she had delivered that morning. She had spoken about dignity, equal treatment, and restoring trust between communities and public institutions. The applause had been generous, yet she understood that speeches alone changed very little. Trust was built in ordinary moments, when no microphones were present and no audience expected perfection. That belief stayed with her as she guided the sport utility vehicle into the quiet gas station. She noticed the faded paint on the fuel pumps, the flower baskets hanging outside the convenience store, and a young cashier helping an elderly customer count loose change with remarkable patience. Victoria smiled softly because places like this represented the heartbeat of the state more honestly than any government building ever could. She stepped out carrying nothing except her wallet and car keys, unaware that within minutes a routine stop would become the kind of moment that tested not only one officer's judgment, but also the value she had spent her entire career defending. Officer Daniel Mercer had built his reputation on certainty. During 12 years in uniform, he had convinced himself that hesitation created danger and confidence prevented mistakes. Fellow officers often described him as decisive, while supervisors praised his willingness to take charge before anyone else reacted. Those compliments had slowly transformed into something far less reliable. He no longer viewed first impressions as possibilities. He treated them as facts. As he watched Victoria Brooks standing beside the government vehicle, his mind assembled a complete story long before any evidence had the chance to speak for itself. A state-registered sport utility vehicle, an unfamiliar face, no visible security detail, comfortable clothing instead of a formal suit. Every observation seemed to reinforce the conclusion he had already accepted. It never occurred to him that appearances could be misleading. It never crossed his mind that authority did not always announce itself with flashing lights and official ceremonies. Mercer stepped closer, keeping his voice firm enough for everyone nearby to hear. He believed public confidence depended on visible control. The customers filling their tanks gradually stopped what they were doing. A truck driver leaned against his pickup. A young mother quietly guided her children closer to the convenience store entrance. Even Kevin Foster, the station manager, paused while restocking bottled water near the front door. Nobody interrupted. They simply watched. Victoria met the officers, eyes with remarkable composure. Years in public office had taught her that calmness often revealed more than arguments ever could. She had faced hostile debates, emotional town hall meetings, and difficult negotiations where every word carried enormous consequences. Compared with those moments, this conversation seemed surprisingly quiet. She answered each question politely, never raising her voice or showing frustration. That calm unsettled Mercer more than resistance would have. In his experience, nervous people explained too much, while guilty people tried to appear confident. He convinced himself her steady demeanor fit the second category. Every respectful response became, in his mind, another reason to doubt her. Emily Carter, the young cashier, glanced through the front windows several times. Something about the woman's behavior did not match the officer's assumptions. She saw no panic, no hostility, and no attempt to leave. Instead, she saw someone patiently allowing the situation to unfold with quiet dignity. Kevin noticed the same thing. He had owned the station for nearly 20 years and had learned that character often revealed itself in small moments. The woman thanked another customer who accidentally brushed against her shoulder. She smiled reassuringly at an elderly man who looked uncomfortable watching the exchange. Nothing about her suggested arrogance or disrespect. Mercer requested identification once again. Victoria Nadif. I would be happy to provide it if you will allow me to reach into my jacket. The request was simple. The tone was respectful. Yet Mercer interpreted even that careful wording as another attempt to control the conversation. He shook his head before answering. Not yet. I am asking the questions. A heavy silence settled over the parking lot. The afternoon breeze carried the distant sound of passing traffic across the highway, while everyone waited to see what would happen next. Victoria looked briefly toward the horizon, then back at the officer. There was no fear in her expression, only quiet disappointment. She had spent years encouraging trust between public servants and the communities they represented. Standing there beside an ordinary gas pump, she realized that trust could disappear in a single moment when assumptions spoke louder than facts. Even then, she chose patience over pride, believing that the truth did not become stronger by being shouted. It simply waited for the moment when someone was finally willing to see it. The longer silence lasted, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. People who had stopped only for fuel now found themselves standing still, watching a conversation that no longer felt routine. A delivery driver quietly folded his receipt into his pocket without taking his eyes off the scene. An elderly woman waiting for her husband outside the convenience store frowned with growing concern. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, but everyone sensed that something important was unfolding. Officer Mercer looked around and noticed the growing audience. Instead of slowing down, he became even more determined to demonstrate that he was in complete control of the situation. Years of experience had taught him that confidence often discouraged questions, so he straightened his shoulders and spoke louder than before. I have reasonable concerns about this vehicle and your identity, he declared. Until I verify everything, you are not free to leave. Victoria remained composed. Officer, I have cooperated with every request you have made. My identification is available the moment you allow me to retrieve it safely. Mercer shook his head before she could finish. That is not how this works. The words echoed across the parking lot. Kevin Foster exchanged a worried glance with Emily Carter. Neither of them understood why such a calm interaction continued to escalate. The woman had answered every question respectfully. She had not argued, refused instructee. Victoria Brooks remained exactly where she had been instructed to stand, her breathing slow and steady as the growing chorus of approaching sirens drifted closer across the afternoon sky. Around her, uncertainty spread through the gas station like a passing storm. Nobody understood why so many emergency vehicles would be heading toward such a quiet stretch of highway. Officer Daniel Mercer glanced briefly toward the distant lights before returning his attention to Victoria, convinced the arriving units would simply assist with what he believed was a routine investigation. His confidence remained unshaken because he still believed every conclusion he had reached was supported by common sense. Victoria looked at him with quiet patience rather than frustration. Officer, she said in a calm voice, there's still time to verify everything before this becomes something larger than either of us wants. Mercer answered without hesitation. Everything is already under control. Those words lingered in the air as the first flashes of blue reflected against the windows of the convenience store. Kevin Foster stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the afternoon sun. Emily Carter followed a few steps behind him, her concern growing with every passing second. Neither of them had ever seen such a coordinated response arriving at their small station. Customers who had been preparing to leave quietly remained where they were, drawn by the unusual sight approaching from the highway. Victoria noticed the attention, but never attempted to explain herself. She could have identified her office with a single sentence. She could have ended every misunderstanding before the next patrol vehicle reached the entrance. Instead, she remained silent because something inside her wanted to know whether fairness depended upon a title or whether it truly belonged to every citizen equally. The answer mattered more than her personal comfort. A light breeze carried the scent of fresh rain from distant fields while the line of patrol vehicles grew larger. Mercer finally reached for his radio to request an update. Before he could finish speaking, another transmission interrupted with unusual urgency. The message was brief, professional, and impossible to ignore. Additional units were instructed to proceed directly to the location without delay. Mercer frowned. That was unexpected. He looked toward Victoria again, searching her face for any sign of nervousness. He found none. Instead, she offered a small, almost sympathetic smile that seemed completely out of place under the circumstances. It was not the smile of someone expecting revenge. It was the expression of someone hoping another person would still have the opportunity to make the right decision. Emily quietly whispered to Kevin, "She does not look afraid." Kevin nodded slowly. "No," he replied. "She looks like someone waiting for the truth to catch up." The word stayed with Emily as more vehicles entered the parking lot in perfect formation. Their movements were organized, deliberate, and unmistakably disciplined. Conversations stopped completely. Engines were switched off. Even the sounds of passing traffic seemed distant now. Mercer straightened his uniform and prepared to brief the arriving officers, expecting confirmation that his judgment had been correct from the beginning. Victoria lifted her eyes toward the lead vehicle as it rolled to a smooth stop only a few yards away. The driver's door opened. A senior officer wearing the insignia of a state police colonel stepped onto the pavement with measured confidence. He surveyed the scene for only a moment before his eyes settled on Victoria, and the expression on his face changed instantly from routine professionalism to unmistakable recognition. Colonel James Holloway did not rush. His measured steps across the pavement carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood that composure often spoke louder than commands. Every pair of eyes followed him as he approached the center of the parking lot. Officer Daniel Mercer immediately stepped forward, prepared to deliver what he believed was a straightforward briefing. "Colonel," Mercer began, "I detained this individual while investigating a possible misuse of a state vehicle. I was in the process of verifying her identity." Holloway listened without interruption, his expression impossible to read. When Mercer finished, the colonel shifted his attention toward Victoria Brooks. His posture changed instantly. He offered a respectful nod before speaking in a calm, steady voice. "Good afternoon, Governor Brooks. I apologize for the delay." The words settled over the gas station with astonishing force. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The breeze continued to stir the flags above the fuel pumps, but every person standing there seemed frozen by the simple sentence they had just heard. Emily Carter covered her mouth in disbelief. Kevin Foster slowly removed his baseball cap without realizing he had done so. The truck driver who had been watching from beside his pickup quietly lowered his phone, his expression filled with surprise. Mercer stared at the colonel as though he had misheard him. His eyes shifted from Holloway back to Victoria and then to the state vehicle parked beside the pump. Pieces that had never seemed connected suddenly formed a picture he had completely failed to recognize. Victoria answered the colonel with the same calm dignity she had shown since arriving. "Good afternoon, Colonel. Thank you for coming." There was no anger in her voice. No triumph. No attempt to embarrass anyone standing there. That unexpected grace only deepened the silence surrounding the moment. Holloway looked briefly toward Mercer before speaking again. "Governor, is everyone safe?" Victoria nodded gently. "Yes, everyone is safe." She could have offered a lengthy explanation. She could have listed every misunderstanding that had unfolded during the past several minutes. Instead, she chose only the truth that mattered most. Holloway acknowledged her response with another respectful nod before quietly addressing the officers who had arrived with him. His instructions were calm, professional, and deliberate. There were no raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. The atmosphere itself had already changed. Authority no longer rested on assumptions, but on verified facts. Mercer remained motionless, struggling to reconcile the confidence he had felt only moments earlier with the reality now standing before him. He remembered every conclusion he had reached before allowing the evidence to speak. He remembered dismissing each opportunity to verify information that had been freely offered. Around the parking lot, the customers who had witnessed the entire encounter exchanged thoughtful glances. What they had just seen was more than an unexpected revelation. It was a reminder that appearances could shape opinions with astonishing speed, while truth often arrived quietly and without announcement. Victoria looked across the gathered crowd, meeting the eyes of strangers who only minutes earlier had known nothing about her. She did not see enemies. She saw neighbors, travelers, workers, and families whose confidence and fairness depended on moments exactly like this. The afternoon sun began dipping lower toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the concrete. In that warm golden light, the entire scene felt transformed. The question was no longer who Victoria Brooks was. The question had become how such an ordinary afternoon had revealed something far more important than a person's title. The difference between believing you know the truth and taking the time to discover it. The realization settled over Officer Daniel Mercer far more heavily than any spoken correction ever could. Only minutes earlier, he had been absolutely certain that experience alone was enough to judge the situation before him. Now that certainty had disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch across the entire gas station. Colonel James Holloway turned toward him with the same calm professionalism he had shown from the moment he arrived. "Officer Mercer," he said evenly, "we will verify every detail through the proper process." There was no anger in his voice and no public lecture. The restraint itself carried weight. Mercer gave a slow nod, unable to find the confidence that had filled every sentence he had spoken before. Victoria Brooks looked from the colonel to the gathering crowd. She noticed anxious expressions beginning to soften as confusion gave way to understanding. Emily Carter quietly exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath for what felt like several minutes. Kevin Foster lowered his eyes for a moment, reflecting on how quickly an ordinary afternoon had become something none of them would ever forget. One of the state police officers approached Victoria respectfully and confirmed that her travel schedule had been secured and that her staff had been notified. She thanked him with a simple smile before turning back toward Mercer. Everyone expected a confrontation. Instead, they witnessed something entirely different. "Officer," Victoria said gently, "I hope today becomes a lesson rather than a burden you carry forever." Mercer looked at her with visible disbelief. He had expected criticism, perhaps even public embarrassment. Instead, he was being offered something he had not earned in that moment, the opportunity to learn. "Governor," he answered quietly, "I should have listened before reaching conclusions." Victoria nodded once. Every public servant makes difficult decisions. The important question is whether those decisions begin with facts or assumptions. Her words were not spoken from Mercer alone. They reached every person standing within earshot. The truck driver who had remained beside his pickup slowly placed his phone into his pocket. The young family preparing to leave the station exchanged thoughtful glances. Even strangers who had never met one another understood they had witnessed more than an unexpected encounter. They had watched two very different ways of exercising authority. One relied upon immediate judgment. The other relied upon patience, dignity, and truth. Colonel Holloway quietly instructed his team to document the incident according to department policy. Body camera recordings, dispatch communications, and witness statements would all be reviewed through established procedures. There would be no rushed conclusions because the purpose of accountability was not humiliation. It was restoring confidence that every situation would be examined fairly. As those conversations began, the atmosphere changed once again. Customers returned to their vehicles, although many paused before leaving, offering Victoria respectful smiles or quiet words of encouragement. She thanked each person with the same humility she had shown since arriving. She did not speak as a governor addressing constituents. She spoke as a neighbor speaking to neighbors. The afternoon sun continued sinking toward the horizon, covering the parking lot with long golden shadows. Mercer remained standing where he was, watching the ordinary rhythm of the gas station slowly return. For the first time that day, he understood that real authority was never measured by how quickly someone could take control of a situation. It was measured by the wisdom to pause, seek the truth, and remember that every person deserved the same measure of dignity before any conclusion was ever reached. By early evening, the last state police vehicles had begun leaving the gas station, but the questions raised during that quiet afternoon were only beginning their journey. Colonel James Holloway remained long enough to ensure that every required procedure was initiated with care and transparency. Dispatch recordings would be preserved. Body camera footage would be reviewed. Written statements from witnesses would be collected without assumption or preference. The purpose was not to defend anyone or condemn anyone before the facts had been fully examined. The purpose was to protect public trust. Officer Daniel Mercer stood beside his patrol vehicle in thoughtful silence as another supervisor briefly explained the next administrative steps. He listened without interruption. For the first time in many years, he realized that confidence without humility could become its own blind spot. No one raised their voice. No one treated him with disrespect. The accountability he faced came through the very system he had sworn to uphold. That realization weighed more heavily than any public criticism could have. Across the parking lot, Kevin Foster unlocked the convenience store doors once again for customers who had patiently waited through the unexpected events. Emily Carter returned behind the register, but she found herself replaying the afternoon in her mind. She had watched assumptions form in only a few moments, yet it had taken patience, evidence, and professionalism to replace those assumptions with truth. She quietly promised herself never to judge another person based only on appearances, no matter how convincing first impressions might seem. As Victoria Brooks prepared to continue her trip, Colonel Holloway approached once more. "Governor," he said respectfully, "your security team is ready whenever you are." Victoria thanked him before looking back toward the small gathering of people who had remained nearby. "I appreciate everyone's patience today," she said warmly. "I know this was unexpected." An elderly couple smiled and wished her a safe drive. The truck driver tipped his cap before climbing back into his cab. A young father lifted his daughter into the family vehicle, quietly telling her that treating people fairly was one of the most important lessons a person could learn. Those simple moments meant more to Victoria than any formal ceremony. They reminded her why public service existed in the first place. Before entering her vehicle, she turned toward Mercer one final time. He met her eyes with genuine sincerity. "Governor Brooks," he said, "I cannot change what happened today, but I can learn from it." Victoria gave a small nod. Learning is where better decisions begin. There was no applause, no dramatic speeches, only a brief exchange between two people standing in the fading sunlight, surrounded by ordinary Americans returning to their daily lives. Sometimes the most meaningful changes arrived quietly, carried not by headlines but by honest reflection. As the governor's vehicle pulled onto the highway, the evening sky glowed with shades of orange and deep blue stretching across the horizon. The gas station slowly returned to what it had always been, another peaceful stop along a familiar road. Yet every person who had witnessed the events of that afternoon carried away something different. They left with the understanding that titles may reveal who a person is, but character is revealed long before names or positions become known. And somewhere inside Officer Mercer, a lesson that had taken only one afternoon to begin would likely remain for the rest of his career. reminding him that the strongest authority is not found in certainty alone, but in the willingness to seek the truth before reaching a conclusion. Several weeks later, the afternoon at the small gas station had become more than an isolated incident. The official review had been completed through established procedures, supported by dispatch records, body camera footage, witness statements, and every available piece of objective evidence. The findings were discussed professionally, not as a search for someone to blame, but as an opportunity to strengthen public confidence in the principles every officer was expected to uphold. Additional training emphasized careful verification, respectful communication, and the importance of recognizing how quickly assumptions could influence decisions. For Governor Victoria Brooks, the experience remained deeply personal, yet she never allowed it to become a story centered only on herself. During a statewide leadership conference attended by community members, law enforcement representatives, educators, and local officials, she spoke about the afternoon without mentioning names. She described an ordinary stop at a familiar place, a misunderstanding that could have been prevented, and the quiet power of choosing patience over pride. The measure of justice, she told the audience, is not how we treat the people whose titles we recognize. It is how we treat the strangers whose stories we do not yet know. The room fell silent, not because her words were dramatic, but because they felt true. Among those listening from the audience sat Officer Daniel Mercer. He had spent the previous weeks reflecting on every decision he had made that afternoon. He had replayed each conversation, each assumption, and each opportunity he had overlooked. The experience had changed the way he approached every interaction afterward. He asked more questions before reaching conclusions. He listened longer before speaking. He reminded younger officers that confidence should never replace curiosity and that respect should never depend on appearance, occupation, or background. The lesson he carried forward was not born from humiliation. It was born from accountability and the willingness to grow. After the event concluded, Mercer quietly approached Victoria. There were no cameras waiting outside and no reporters recording the conversation. "Governor," he said sincerely, "thank you for choosing understanding when you had every reason to choose anger." Victoria smiled gently. Every person has the ability to become better tomorrow than they were yesterday. That includes every public servant and every citizen. They shook hands before walking in different directions, each carrying the same hope that future encounters between communities and those who serve them would begin with dignity instead of doubt. Months later, Kevin Foster still greeted travelers with the same friendly smile at his gas station, while Emily Carter often remembered the afternoon whenever she met someone new. She had learned that the first chapter of a person's story was almost never enough to understand the whole book. Life at the station returned to its familiar rhythm of coffee cups, road maps, laughter, and families passing through on long drives across the state. Yet the memory of that day quietly remained, not as a symbol of division, but as a reminder that fairness is built through ordinary choices made one conversation at a time. Because in the end, authority may earn attention, titles may earn recognition, and uniforms may represent responsibility, but character is revealed by something far simpler. It is revealed by the willingness to see another human being before seeing assumptions. Respect should never arrive only after recognition. If dignity depends upon knowing someone's name or position, then justice has already taken a wrong turn. The strongest communities are built when every person is treated with fairness long before the truth introduces itself.